Good morning, everyone. My name is Gwen Moore, and I'm a member of Congress, and I represent Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and some of the surrounding suburban areas, the 4th Congressional District of Wisconsin. Let me invite you this morning to the Congressional Black Caucus's annual legislative conference on this is the Child Welfare Braintrust. We are so happy today to have a distinguished panel to walk us through why Kinship Care is a critical factor in providing stability for children and promoting the preservation of families and sharing of culture within Black communities. Our sponsor for this program, very generous sponsor that has demonstrated over time their concern and care for the most vulnerable people in our society, our children, is none other than the Casey Foundation. And here today, representing the Casey Foundation and their programs, is our good friend Christine Calpin, and I'm going to invite her up to share some comments with us now.
Thank you, Congresswoman Moore. I want to also welcome all of you here today and thank you for taking time to join us in this important session on kinship care. My name is Christine Calpin, and I'm the Managing Director for Public Policy at Casey Family Programs. On behalf of our Board of Trustees and our President and CEO, William Bell, it is my privilege to welcome all of you today. Casey Family Programs is the nation's largest operating foundation focused on safely reducing the need for foster care. We work in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and directly with tribal nations to influence long-lasting improvements to the safety and success of children, families, and the communities in which they live. We believe that every child deserves a safe, supportive, and permanent family, and that every family should have the support of a strong and caring community. We've enjoyed a long-standing partnership with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation and are thrilled to be here today with all of you. We're very grateful for their engagement and their work alongside us in today's conversation. I also want to express our appreciation for the leadership and dedication of Congresswoman Moore to the children and families throughout her career. She and her staff have dedicated so much time and engagement on this topic. We have a great panel of individuals today, and I want to thank you all, our audience, and all of you watching for joining us today. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Sixto Cancel, who is the moderator of the program. Sixto is the founder and CEO of Think of Us. Think of Us is an action tank working to drive systemic change in child welfare policy and practice. Among the many accolades that Sixto has received for his unwavering commitment and passion to this work, he's been named as Forbes' top 30 under 30 social entrepreneurs, has been recognized by the White House as a White House champion of change, and also has been recognized as a millennial maker by Black Entertainment Television. Sixto is truly a champion of youth and foster care and has driven home the idea that good policy can only be made when you involve those who have experienced and engaged in the system, in the planning, and in the implementation of this hard work. Welcome, Sixto, and thank you again to all of you for joining us today.
All right, thank you for that. All right, good morning, everyone. Oh, no, we're going to try this again. I don't want to move you from your seats closer, so you have to give me a real good morning now. Good morning, folks.
Good morning.
Okay, folks don't want to move just yet. No, but welcome to a very important conversation. I'm so excited to be here with you all and thankful for the Casey Foundation for sponsoring such an important conversation. A conversation that has gone invisible for too many years, and today we're going to give light to that. And so one of the things I want to do is set the tone by saying we want to honor what the information you're about to hear on the stage. Some of us will be sharing personal lived experience. Some of us have worked in the actual system that we're talking about. Some of us have our own experience outside of the system but still affected by it. And so I want to go ahead and name that the trigger warning around heavy moments. So today we're going to talk about kinship care, but most folks probably are wondering, what is kinship care? How many are you familiar with foster care? Okay. And how many of you are familiar with the term kinship care? Okay. And so foster care is a result of a child coming into the system because of physical, sexual, emotional abuse, or neglect, right? We built a system that's supposed to address abuse, but yet 64% of the kids in our system actually are in the system because of neglect, and usually tied to poverty issues. And so we defaulted to this. When families have to be separated, they tend to come into care, and only 33% of young people who are in foster care are living with a relative or someone that they know. But we believe at Think of Us that could be as high as 70 to 80%, and we see some counties who have done that. So imagine being able to live with a relative. Living with a relative is kinship care. But to really bring this forward, I want to pass it to Angela. And Angela, I want you to bring us into some of the experiences you had about being a kin relative and being able to provide kinship care to your nephew.
Thank you. For me to be involved with kinship, I was able to raise my nephew. My brother was murdered in 1990. So by me able to raise him, I learned a lot from him being in my home. I learned just because he was in my home, when he came in, I noticed he wouldn't unpack his bag. And at the time when he came into my care, he was age 12. I was looking for him for years, but I started working in a residential place, and he became a resident there. And I kept looking at this child like he looked so familiar. So I had to quit my job at that time to care for him because of conflict of interest. But what I have learned when he came into my home, like for 2 years, I kept seeing that he wouldn't unpack that bag. And one day when I came home, the neighbors was telling me that the kids was cursing out her other kids and throwing stuff. So when I came in, he was taking that bag and was coming down the stairs. And I was like, "Where are you going?" And he was like, "I know I have to be removed." Now, mind you, he's my biological nephew, but in his mind, everything that went wrong, he kept thinking that was going to be the day he had to leave. And I was like, "Well, why would you think you have to leave?" He said, "Because I heard what the neighbor said, and I usually be blamed, so I know I got to go." I said, "No, cursing like that, I know my kids did it. They heard it from me." So I said, "So you barely even talk, so I know it wasn't you." And the next day, that bag was unpacked. Now, mind you, it was 2 years, and no matter how much I kept putting that stuff in the dresser, I even took the bag out of his room and take it in the basement. He'll still find it and put his stuff right back in that bag. And I had to pick my battles like, okay, just because it's my house, I don't want to force a rule, but it's got to be more than this, that why won't he unpack this bag? He with family. So I learned then, even though they're placed with family, they come in with a lot of trauma. And not only did he finally unpack that bag, during that time, he kept setting my house on fire. So even the workers was like, "We trying to find somewhere now. We know you want them to be removed." I was like, "No, leave them alone." I was like, "Don't remove them. If you keep removing them, then as an adult, how is he going to be a productive citizen? Because he's never going to stop. He's going to have to get help." I said, "Put me more services in place." And that's how I learned about wraparound service, which I actually work for to this day. I never even knew services was out there to address mental health needs. So just the fact of me raising my nephew, I think that stopped the person becoming more in the community to do more harm. I learned by him setting them fires why he was in foster care, not with relatives, he was touched. So I never knew the fire, killing other animals, tied all into that. But I learned that by taking certain classes that was offered to me through wraparound to inform me. So that later on led to my career to want to be an advocacy and work in group homes and do more out in the community just by meeting my nephew. Because I was like, how many more kids is affected like this? And this is my family. So, yeah.
So one of the things I want to highlight here are some of the barriers that you heard and ways that the system is structured. Our system is designed to mitigate as much risk and safety. And so here you have an aunt saying, "I am fully committed in the most extreme situations to still show up," and you're recommending a removal. Instead of us thinking about what if the system looked differently, that when an aunt raises her hand, we say we don't have to figure out that wraparound service was a thing. We already were positioned to provide services. We were already positioned to provide that mental health. And if we even do it better, how about we had never placed that child in a stranger foster home in the beginning because there was always an aunt who was willing to be there. So I just want to point that out. Any quick reflections from folks before I move on to the second question? And I'll introduce each panelist as I ask you your question, because I skipped that part. I got too excited, y'all. So I'm going to go ahead. Thank you, Angela. And Angela, for your work as a lived experience advocate, for your work in the mental health field today. And so I'm going to go ahead now to Dr. Anita. And Dr. Anita, I know you're the executive director and founder of Sankofa, and you have done amazing work. Would love for you to quickly introduce yourself, and then I'm going to go ahead and ask you a question around placing a child who has been in foster care in a Kim home comes with challenges for the child and the Kim giver. In your experience and your work, what type of supports are needed to ensure a Kim placement is successful? Are these supports readily available?
Are these? My name is Dr. Annetta Wilson. I'm the executive director and founder of Sankofa Safe Child Initiative. It's a child welfare agency that was developed as of a town hall meeting that was held by Congressman Danny K. Davis in 1999. As a result of, well, let me go back. Let me just tell the story like it is. Because I wrote it down, but let me just tell it from my heart. Because there were several issues that mothers were having in getting their children home, return home. And because during that particular time, I was a social worker and a director working in an agency and monitoring programs throughout the state for DCFS, for pregnant and parenting youth that was in care. Well, lo and behold, one Sunday, my priest asked me to take one of the grandmothers to visit their children. Now, mind you, I live in a community, and where these children were placed was 96 miles away from the community. So when they removed the two children from their grandparents, which I couldn't understand why so far away, and none of their other family members could get to go and visit them, and the grandmother couldn't go to visit them unless someone took her. My priest asked me to take her that Sunday to visit her grandchildren. Well, to make a long story short, it hurt me so bad when we were about to leave and the two children grabbed her legs. Don't leave me. Don't leave me. And she couldn't do anything about it. She was crying, the kids was crying, and I was crying. So, what happened is I came home and I immediately got on the phone to the congressman. I said, we need to have a town hall meeting. Jess McDonald, who was the director of DCFS at that particular time, we had the town hall meeting, and there were people, like over 200 and some people that came. The police had to be called because it got out of hand and so forth, but we calmed it down. And as a result of that, to make a long story short, Jess McDonald stood up, who was the director of DCFS at the time, and he said, well, I'll give you $50,000 to start this program. I said, hold up. We have a program already designed. Let us have another meeting, and we'll present the program to you, because I don't have it here at this time. Lo and behold, about a week and a half later, the congressman had another meeting with Jess McDonald, and we presented the program to him in the tune of $290,000, and he funded it. And as a result of that, Sankofa has been around since the beginning. So let me tell you a little bit about Kinship, and I'm fast forwarding because I have several programs that we do around parenting, anger management, domestic violence, but I wanted to stick to the agenda today because I can tell you about, we work with juvenile justice, the whole, criminal justice, the whole 9 yards. So I try to surround all the program, all the problems that our community has, and I try to work on those. But anyway, let me stick to the agenda for today. As a result of, I'm going to say, having 2 grandparents who had 10 grandchildren in their care, and we couldn't find housing for them. So I said, well, we have to do something. So I knew some construction people and called some finance people, and they could say what they want to say, but Boyovich, who was our governor at the time, he gave me $13 million to help build our 58 unit of housing. And 35 units of housing was supposed to be for grandparents raising grandchildren. And I had the architect to develop some 3 and 4 bedrooms because of the 2 grandparents that I couldn't find housing for them. But we had to rent 2 homes in 2 suburban areas. And at that particular time, they, of course, she didn't have enough money to pay rent, pay the water bill, the gas bill, the whole thing. I paid for 2 years out of my own pocket her water bill and the gas bill. That's just how dedicated that we were to this project. And so as a result of the 58 unit of housing, 23 units was supposed to be for youth that was aging out of DCFS. Well, when the directors changed and Brian Samuels was the director at the time that we developed this program and developed the 58 unit of housing, well, by that time, he ended up in Washington, D.C., and we got a new director who wasn't dedicated to what the past director had said. That was a whole big mess. But anyway, I had to end up not only putting other people, because we had to, put some bodies in there to pay some rent and so forth. But as a result of that, we have, I still have 5 of the original grandparents that moved in when we opened up the establishment in December of 2008. And so the fast forward, Kinship does much better. We learned so much more from the grandparents raising their grandchildren. I had all kinds of issues. We had some youth that were autistic. We had some youth that needed some mental health problems. But within this village that we were building within the grandparents' housing, we were able to address all of those needs. And to this day, I still have 5 of those grandparents there. But to fast forward and show you how good Kinship really is. Now, 2008, you said those kids grown up and grown out. Yes, most of them have. And the majority of the grandparents that moved in originally are deceased now. Because you said some of the statistics, the average grandparent that moved in at that time was between 71 and 82. And even though now I have some that are 35, I have 2 that's 35 in the building, but the majority of them are still older. But what I learned in the last 4 or 5 years is that the 5 that we have there, 3 of their grandchildren have rented the 1-bedroom housing and stay in that building. So as a result, 3 years ago, we did some intergenerational kind of things and so forth. And there's not a lot of funding out there, as you alluded to. They don't want to pay for Kinship. They don't want to do for grandparents raising grandchildren. They would rather give it to foster care than to provide for grandparents raising grandchildren. I have had to go get grants from the Department of Aging to work with my grandparents raising grandchildren, just to be able to give them some respite care, to be able to buy some clothes for those grandchildren. So there's all kind of things that we're going to talk to the Congresswoman about, and you know, I drive Danny Davis crazy, but anyway. So that's a little bit about what I do. I'm going to shut up so everybody else get a chance.
Listen, yes, thank you. I think some of the things that I hear, I just want to go ahead and repeat for those of you taking notes and for those of you who are going to start doing things with these notes, right? So some of the things I heard was, you know, that we had to figure out how is it that kin, whether it's grandma, uncle, or aunt, gets the same type of supports that a foster parent gets. In most states, there are, unless you are licensed as a foster parent, you will not get the national average of $800 a month. You can apply for TANF for $200 a month, but how many of us know $200 per child is not going to do it, right? All right. There's also things that I heard around housing, the barrier to housing. When a grandma, uncle, aunt, cousin has to take in a sibling sat, you might need a bigger apartment because, unfortunately, in child welfare, we have some rules that we made for foster parents, like 350 square feet per child. In Maryland, no bunk beds. You know, so there are things that get in the way. And so do those rules need to be the same for grandma, uncle, aunt? Could we have a different process for them? Should we have a different process for them? These are the questions that folks are struggling with now.
Well, Congresswoman Gwen was a part of a hearing that she had was it 2 years ago or 3 years ago that the Congressman and her had. And I brought up one of the grandparents to testify at the hearing. And so she's she's on top of everything. So she knows what the problems is. The problems is some of her colleagues don't want to hear what is really needed out here for grandparents or kinship care.
So
stop trying to put it into a program that don't work. Foster care doesn't work for kinship. So
That's right.
if they would stop trying to put a pig in a whatever they call that.
If I can also say, even when I was in kinship, I was never given the option that my nephew had to be removed. They always built on family. I had resources as in support groups. And later on, the more behavior problems that my nephew had in the mental health, they then told me I had to come from kinship and become a treatment foster parent. And as soon as I lost my job, they said, well, if you don't make enough income, you can't just live off this income. We're going to remove them. It was always something about remove versus even when my sister became kinship, she would not switch over from my experience. And I told her, I said, do not become a treatment foster parent. Kinship was better. And my nephew, my great-nephew, is 16 to this day, and she had him ever since he was 3 months old. She never switched over and got a job because kinship, they even sent her, like, a lot of supports, like donations or whatever, and anything supporting the community. She'd rather deal with just that, knowing that she cannot lose her grandson. But that is something that when she was speaking, I'm like, I was so much better when I was in kinship. But as soon as I lost my job, they were quick to say, well, if you don't help him get a job, you can't get licensed again. So the difference with that.
So one thing I just want to point out that kinship works so differently across the country because it's really up to the community. And so in some communities, you're going to get the support you just heard. In other communities, the community hasn't been activated on that issue. And so what we're thinking through is what does it look like to actually support kin across the country? And I want to pass it to Michael, who's the Connecticut's Commissioner over Operations, and want to talk to you, like, what are some of the barriers? We know that kinship placement is important. And while some states are moving forward to make more placements of children in foster care with kin, others are struggling to do so. From a state's perspective, what are the challenges or obstacles of placing children with kin?
Sure. Good morning, and thank you, Sixto. It's a privilege to be with you on this panel. For those who don't know, he is a product of Connecticut that we're very proud of, and his compassion and his commitment has made not only the national foster care system, child welfare system better, but he has impacted the state of Connecticut to where we can proudly say we're one of the best child welfare systems in the nation because of his work. And so we're grateful for all that you do. Answering that question just by way of context, let me just talk a bit about how we got here from an evolutionary perspective, and that is particularly when we look at the crack epidemic that hit black and brown communities hard in the late 80s and 90s. You know, child welfare, child protection was designed to intervene whenever there's an allegation of abuse and neglect of a child. Rightfully so. Whenever children are in trouble, there have to be a response. It's the intervention that we did that's the problem. And our intervention back in the day when parents were struggling with crack addictions was to not even think about kin and relatives first. We thought about the safety of the child first, and we brought the child into legal foster care. And when a child enters into a state foster care system, there are rules, there are laws, there are regulations that's federal and state that dictates what a state can do by way of placing that child with a caregiver. And those rules and regulations are what got us to this place, along with implicit and very explicit racial bias on behalf of the practitioners in the system. You know, the racial bias looks something like this, that if you didn't know your daughter was using crack cocaine and the children were being abused, then how can we trust you to give you the grandchildren and protect them from your daughter coming back into the house and further neglecting them? Or shame on you that you didn't know, therefore we're not going to look at you. Or why didn't you intervene? And if you were so concerned, you should have been there earlier before we got there. Or the apple don't fall too far from the tree. If your son and daughter have a problem, then we know somewhere in your history you have one too. And then we looked into the criminal background of families to say, in order to put this child in your home, we have to make sure nobody has any kind of criminal background. Well, you think about our community and policing in our community over the years, and you got in a home, there's an uncle, there's an aunt, there are other folks and cousins who live there who may have had problems with law enforcement. Of course they have criminal background situations that had nothing to do with child safety.
That's right.
But because they have a record, say, well, we can't license you for that. Or we look at income and say, do you have sufficient income? And if they're not gainfully employed, if they're on Section 8 and things like that, it's like, well, your income is not sufficient enough, therefore we can't license you. And there was even a clause that said you could even judge by character. And character can mean a whole lot of other things. And people would rule character in certain ways and eliminate relatives for that. Bedroom sizes. You got 3 kids that you want to bring into care, your grandma, your uncle, your aunt, the bedroom size. Kids can sleep together in bedrooms, you know, different beds and bedrooms. Like, nope, the boy has to have his bedroom, the girls have to have their bedroom. Well, how many folks had the luxury of creating that kind of space? And therefore, it became a barrier for licensing. And, you know, and then finally, you know, there were things that were injected into the process, such as what happened to you when you were a child? You know, did you get therapy for your abuse and your neglect? And all of those created significant and unsurmountable barriers for letting children stay with kin, and the very restricted definition of kin being blood. And so when a child said, I want to stay with uncle and auntie, and they go to uncle and auntie and find uncle or auntie is not a blood relative, but yet that's the uncle and auntie that child has known for years, the system said, no, you can't do that. And as a result, during those days in the late 80s, early 90s, foster care rolls swelled. And as those foster care census turned more black and brown, what we were discovering was that a lot of those children that entered into foster care and put into stranger foster homes outside of their communities, away from their families, this strange phenomenon started happening. Kids start running away, you know, and everybody would say, where are they running? They're running home. You know, they're going back to where they came from. And folks were saying, then why are we going against the grain? If this is where children are telling us they're more comfortable and more safe, let's look at the home unit. But, you know, fast forward to today's times with the opioid epidemic, obviously the face of addiction look very different. Suburban and rural communities, racially and ethnically, look very different. The approach is a very different approach now. And the approach for kinship is one that is more humane, more reasonable, and it is appropriate for black and brown communities, that the elimination of all of those insurmountable barriers were there, to where now we look to see how can we make children, if they are not safe to stay at home, how can we make sure that the first place they go to is someone they know and someone they're related to and someone who cares for them. That's what Kinship Care is about. And then once you've identified that person, all resources come with it, compared to identifying a placement first and then trying to make that fit when it just didn't back in the day.
One of the things I want to point out here is that about 33% of all children in the United States will experience an investigation. They'll get that knock on the door. A social worker will interview, and they'll ask these questions of what's going on. And when it comes down to black families, though, 53% of all black families will experience that social worker knocking on the door before a child's 18. When we look around the room, that's about 1 in every 2 of us have had that experience. But it's our secret that we don't talk about. And then when we have to come into care, 10% of all black children will experience foster care. 10%. When I think about, you know, the barriers that you were sharing and how we've gotten here, you know, my mother struggled with drug addiction, and that's why I entered foster care, along with my other siblings, and she had 8 children altogether. And I entered as an 11-month baby, then was adopted by the age of 9, but that adoption was very abusive, very racist, and so by 13, I was couch surfing. I was running away. And by the time I was 15, I then was able to prove all the abuse. I literally taped a recorder to my chest and literally had evidence to say, here's what's actually happening, and then came back into the system until I aged out. But what's ironic is that I lived my whole life being told, you know, behave or you'll go to a group home. Lived my whole life being said there's not a placement for you. To this very day, I'm not connected to not one of the foster parents I've had my entire life that I was, quote, quote, raised with. And 3 years ago, my sister calls me while I'm in New York City. And I grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, very close to each other. And she says, hey, there's a family reunion today. Do you want to go? I wanted to say something smart like, you just going to call me today? With 3-hour notice, this is something that you might want to talk to a therapist or 2 about, figure out how you're going to show up, you know? But obviously the answer was yes. And so we go to Spanish Harlem, we're in the park, and, you know, I'm Afro-Latino, so I'm Puerto Rican. Okay. And very much black. And so I'm going through the park, and like, anybody can be your family, because we all different shades. And I finally get to the place, and, you know, it was a very unspeakable moment. You know, I still don't have words to describe what it meant for the first time at 27 years old, talking to people who look like you, have similar mannerisms, but who are just accepting, right? And as I was there, I realized there was a sibling set of 4 running around who were clearly not black, clearly not Puerto Rican. And it was very confusing because I was asking all types of questions. Who's who? Who's this? And people kept just saying, those are our cousins. Those are our cousins. Those are our cousins. So then finally I went to like the other younger cousins, and I was like, all right, tell me what's really going on. And in that moment, you know, what I found out was that I had 4 uncles and aunts who were foster adopted parents for longer than I had been alive. And all I could do is pull out my phone and GPS to my last foster home, which was 58 minutes away. And so in that moment, what dramatically shifted for me was I had grown up my entire life hearing there's not a placement for you, there's not a place that you can go. And what clicked for me in that moment was I actually could have lived with people who could have loved me.
That's right.
And could have actually been there.
That's right.
And that's not the story. And it's not the story of so many children in the foster care system. Only 33% are living with an actual kin or someone that they know. And it doesn't actually have to be that way. And so when I think of the barriers, it's how do we support systems to have the financing to do the family finding, to be able to go ahead and actually know what's going on. In this case, I want you to talk to the interstate kind of placement barriers that are there.
Yeah, I think your story is one that really describes, what we are experiencing and had experienced in child welfare as it related to the relationship between particularly black communities. The notion that black communities have always stepped forth and raised other people's kids for years. When somebody couldn't raise their kid down the street or whatever, they always brought a kid in their care, provided excellent caregiving. That parent knew who was doing it. That's been an experience that has happened in black communities. Oh, and one of the strengths and assets. So the belief that we don't want to do it is a fallacy. Secondly, the reason why we don't come forth is not because we don't want to do it, it's because they don't want to deal with us. Because we come in with all of our rules, our regulations, all of our nonsense that impacts their ability to give quality parenting to a child, to where they throw their hands up and say, it's not that I don't love my relative, it's that I can't deal with this system anymore, who continues to make my life miserable, investigating me and even putting me in jeopardy because of some of the rules and regulations that the system has, and therefore they walk away. The system has to change, not the community. The system has to find a better way to integrate with the community and the natural behaviors of community when it comes to taking care of their own. In regards to interstate compact, one of the greatest challenges that we have in the system is that our laws are built around believing states' rights, and when a child is removed in Connecticut, we can only impact placing a child in Connecticut. But if grandma lives in Atlanta and the child is in jeopardy of being moved out of Connecticut, grandma says, send him to me, and we say we can't, because that's the state of Georgia. And therefore, there's the interstate compact system that governs what that happens, and that depends on each state having a relationship with each other. There's no federal law that makes this easy. And so the laws of Georgia and the way Georgia practices can be very different from the way Connecticut practices, to where that child ends up in a stranger foster home. Grandma could be waiting for 2 years for the child to get there. And just think about this. If it's a newborn and it goes into a stranger's home for 2 years, that newborn has bonded with these new parents. And now 2 years later, after everything's resolved, the courts are saying, there's no way you can move this baby because the baby is bonded now with the parents, and it would be wrong, psychologically damaging, to introduce this baby to a stranger foster grandparent. And so the interstate compact laws really need to be modernized and standardized, and I would say even federalized, to the point where it makes, around kinship, that it makes it easy on day one when a child comes into foster care and there's a relative, because boundaries, state boundaries should not dictate timeliness of children getting into places where they are cared for by folks they know and folks who are their relatives.
So the things that I start to think about when I think about the possibility here is that we could do this differently. There are things that probably make sense for when you're dealing in a foster care situation. For example, a boy and a girl are not sleeping in the same room. If one's biologically, your foster parent who's a stranger you just met, there may be some arguments there. But when it comes down to kin, does it actually have to be the same, right? And so when I think about this very moment right now, for a long time, there's been a culture of let's not talk about this, let's not talk about this. But now this conversation is bubbling up to the point where people are like, okay, what do we do with kin? Many states are asking themselves that question. And what I believe about this moment is that it's very similar to the smartphone. The flip phone was something that was created to be able to call someone and kind of text some people. But the smartphone never really directly competed with the flip phone. The smartphone was something that just added a different value that happened to do things that a flip phone can do. And so when I think about Kinship Care, I think about it as almost as the smartphone. Yes, it's doing similar things. I'm providing you a place to live. I'm going to make sure that you're safe, and that's what foster care is supposed to be about. But the extra value add here is that you get someone who truly loves you from day one because they've known you. Not that you have to build that love, bond, attachment with the person that you're placed with and figure out how long do I actually have here before I see my stuff in a trash bag and I'm at my next place, right? And so I want to talk to actually one more question here about when it comes down to increasing the number of kinship homes and from a state's perspective, what has been some of the concrete barriers that you've experienced?
Just to kind of toot our own horn in Connecticut, we went from the time when you were in care, our rate of children placed with kin that was in foster care was only like 14%. Today, we're at 52% of kids who come into care going with kin. And it started with leadership making a commitment that no child that enters foster care will go to a stranger's home until we have exhausted every relative that has come forth. And that is what we call in our work a firewall, a very serious firewall. You can't put a kid in a stranger's home. You can't put a kid in a group home or any of those until all relatives have been exhausted. And it's the bio parent's right to bring every relative forth, to say, try this one, try that one, before we give up on putting a child in a kinship home. Some of the significant barriers, that I know a lot of states are facing, has to do with, particularly now that's emerging, when you open the door for kinship and you broaden the definition from just blood relatives to all kin, a coach, a pastor, anyone who has a relationship with that child that could be considered a fictive kin. Now you are kind of like trying to divide the baby up because everybody wants it, right? And so it's which caregiver do you choose, and particularly when you have fathers and the paternal side of the family come forth and they're fighting with the maternal side of the family, and grandma, the dad, and grandma, the mom, are both sitting there saying, I want the grandchild to live with me. Then we're put in a position to try to choose which one would be the most suitable, and trying to do social work to see, can there be a relationship between the two? Though they may not live with you, can you at least provide some kind of relationship so the child can have the benefit of both? And that becomes one of the major barriers. And then the other again, is I believe the stigma and the bias around how folks live is a prevailing barrier in a lot of states, because I hear it often, their home don't look any better than the bio mom's home, or their condition don't look any better, and as if the way their house looks is a maltreatment incident compared to the way a child is treated. Right. And so that first blush when a relative, because it's not an easy thing. Kinship care is more difficult than core foster home. And so for agencies to believe that they can just go and dump and run, put the kid there, leave them, don't do anything, it blows up immediately. So it can't be this dump and run mentality that, okay, a kid is here, get the kid there and let's be done with it. You have to invest financial and economic and clinical and all kinds of supports in that home the way you would if it was a traditional core home, to assure that that placement sticks, because unlike core families who go through the foster care route, they get training before they get a license. Tons of training, then they get a license, then they get a child. On a kin, you get a knock on the door and say, we have your kin, do you want to take them? No training, no preparation, no anything. And our system was designed to say, if you take them, they're yours and we're done, which was the very wrong approach, and they often disrupt it and issues started to surface. It's not a knock on the door, you take them and we leave. It's a knock on the door, here's your kin. How can we support you to care for your kin in the long run so the kin never comes back into care?
Yeah, and Michael, I want to go ahead and push on you a little bit here when we talk about training, because I 10 weeks, 2-hour classes, and I don't feel like that's the sufficient training that folks need to be prepared for it, but I know that's what we make foster parents go through. So I want to actually open it to Dr. Anita and say, like, what are the supports, and Angela, definitely, what are the supports that you've seen that make it actually possible to push forward? Because I know that as a government, we've said, in order to get your license, you need to do these 10 weeks, these 10 courses. But as we know, humans are so much more complex than that. So kind of like, what does work? If I'm making the assumption that, the training doesn't work today.
If you're making the assumption
that the government training doesn't work today,
what
have you seen work? That the government licensing training for foster parents doesn't work as well. And so when I think about kin, I would be like, if we were mandating upfront training before they got their relative. And as Michael pointed out, you don't really have that time anyway. But as people are trying to shape this, people are thinking about, well, what training do we need to give a relative before we put them in place? And that scares me a bit.
Need to change the training. You need to change the training. I have just developed a curriculum that is looking at how do you work with older youth? How do you work with youth that have been traumatized? How do you look at their backgrounds, where they came from? How do you prepare the people that are going to be taking them to work with them, to understand if they wake up in the middle of the night and they're crying and they want their family, or you don't understand what went on with them with that day? We need to look at that whole training. I've just been working with the university and not the university, ICOI, and some past executive directors of DCFS on a curriculum that I'm about ready to show Congressman Davis and Congressman Gwen, because they're all on that committee, of what training needs to be there for people. See, you can't invest and just say, you just give a person 10 hours of training, and I've got it. I think that's what's wrong with some of the foster care stuff, because and I think that because they have taken a cultural piece out of training, they don't really know who that African-American child or that black child is. In our curriculum, you definitely have to teach them who they are, and we're teaching the people who are going to take them who they are also. So we have to look at that whole training piece and revamp it. Don't tell me about fixing what is already there, because that hasn't worked. And don't tell me about fixing pieces of it. Tear the whole doggone thing up. And let's start from our culture of how we actually were doing things, how our families took care of each other without any training at all. You didn't have any training.
Well, when I became a treatment foster parent, none of that training helped but the wraparound process, the mental health, the trauma-informed care. When that part right there, that's all I needed, because as an African-American, I don't think I knew about mental health. Disability to me growing up was what you can visually see. I didn't know the instance training that I had. It gave me a lot of understanding, even for the school system. I was able to know why this child didn't want to go into class, this and that. So I was educated on an IEP. So the best training for a person that I think gave me the patience to understand, if I think his behavior so much, just imagine what he'd been through as a child coming through the door. And I don't want to be a person to add on to that trauma of him going back out that door. I want to make sure he healed, that journey of healing. So I think that's what pours out into our community when we don't take that time in our home to make sure. So with that being said, the biggest training is that mental health piece. I don't even think a lot of African Americans know they even have mental health or trauma because it became the norm.
But even that piece, unless we get rid of the stigma or our people, and I can say our people because I'm sure not black, unless we have black folks understand that what behavior health, mental health is,
That's right.
we're never going to be able to help anyone
You are right.
until we get rid of the stigma.
You are right.
That mental health is not bad. You're not, you know what a group of young people told me a couple of weeks ago? That, Miss Wilson, I'm not crazy.
That's exactly what they say.
And we can call, I've called it counseling through the years. I've called it everything else except mental health. But I went back to the basics and said, we need to deal with the mental health. I need to deal with you guys. You need to understand how you need this counseling, whatever we end up calling it. We still need to deal with the stigma of mental health.
You are 100% right.
Is not a bad thing to have.
That's right.
Yeah. I think along with that, what I've seen to be a very powerful and effective training, if you would, for relative care and kin, particularly in our community, is around managing the dynamics of shifting relationships in the home. That if you and I are brothers, and I now have your child and raising your child, what does that make you to your child, and what does that make me and you as it relates to the child? If I want to cut the child's hair, do you tell me I can't do it when now I'm the caregiver, the legal caregiver of the child, and if I'm a grandparent and the child is now in my care and I have other grandchildren, what does that make that child's relationship to the other grandchildren? Is he still a grandchild, or is he now an uncle aunt role because they're now my child? And managing those complexities is, I think, the most significant intervention of trainings we need, because that's where it breaks down a lot, where siblings say, you can't tell me how to raise my child, and the other siblings say, well, you're not raising your child, I'm raising your child now, or grandparents trying to negotiate the role of their daughter or son in relationship to the baby that they're raising, saying not just DCF say you can't do this, but I say you can't do this because this is my house and now your child is in my care, and unless there is some support around how to manage those relationship shifts that will happen, they have to happen in kinship care, usually the communications and all that breaks down because people just get into these really tough power struggles over their new roles once they get a child placed in their care.
So as people think about how this system, this new version of the system, this new subsystem, as I like to say, is being created, and as folks try to regulate it, as folks try to put legislation to it, how might that type of service be funded? Because the only way that type of services would be funded, correct me if I'm wrong, is that I see as a provider coming in and being able to support, or the agency itself being able to build that capacity. And so those are things that really I have not seen existed just yet. Have you seen?
Yeah, Dr. Joe Crumley out of Philadelphia he has a wonderful curriculum on this. It hadn't take hold across many places, but I mean, he's the guru on all this. He was a caregiver of his daughter's child, and he's a clinical psychologist, and built this whole theory around this dynamics of changing and shifting relationships and power struggles in kinship, what you won't see anywhere else. Core homes, that's regulated. A bio parent's not just going to show up to a core foster home and say, I want to see my child. That the system don't allow it. But they can come home anytime and go to their mama's home and say, I'm here, I want to braid the child's hair, I want to take the kid to the park, I want to do this. And now grandma has to say no, because either it's not safe, you need to be supervised, Or, there are other reasons such as that are imposed by the agency, by the Child Protection Agency, to why that can't happen. So it puts them then in that situation. So, there has to be some clinical support for the caregiver, for the bio parent, and their full extended family on how to manage these new dynamics in their relationship because of this caregiving role that this Ken is now playing.
So I'm going to go ahead and ask you to give a last word, and then Congresswoman, you've been here listening, doing the active listening to this, and what's needed for reform is this right here, which you see on stage, which is the actual people impacted, talking to the people providing services, talking to the people who are running the system. If we're going to solve problems, we need that 360-degree view of what is the problem, how do we all understand it, and then as we try to innovate on solutions, how do we come together? And when folks like you can hear at that and understand it from the different folks, then we can start to actually really craft some structural changes that are different. And so before I turn it to you to give your reflections and what you heard and what stood out to you, would love for each of the panelists to give their final thoughts, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So get your questions ready, because we don't want to be waiting here and think in silence. I'll call on folks. I'm just joking. All right, Angela, want to kick us off?
What I think should happen, like when you first go into the home, is services placed in the home to first give that parent, some people just don't know that opportunity, and I just keep thinking about whatever goes on in the home pours out into the community. So that, to me, is what would cut down a lot of kids being bored or thinking that's the norm, or thinking it's like a hopelessness. I remember a child telling me before that they were hopeless, and it was a male. So I also noticed that it's not even enough resources or enough help for males versus women and kids. So just those areas right there that I would like to get more involved in advocacy and building the people up with the right skills. I've learned working in the community a lot. You can tell a person to go get a job, but then they don't even know how to apply for one, what to wear there. So instead of just looking like, why don't you know, I'm willing to even take that time where you don't have to find someone. I would donate that time just so I can see my community does better. And just the stereotype to stop, like we have to break those generation curses, to me. So.
Thank you. Dr. Anita?
Well, I would really love to see the day when we had less systems involved, and to see I would like to, let me just say it. I would like to see smaller departments of children and family services, that they go back to child protection and let community agencies take care of their communities.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would say first that, I think all states now, based on, federal law that you all have passed, and the Congresswoman's been a champion in passing laws that's kind of revolutionizing child welfare and child protection. All states are now having to really increase kinship and relative care, and we see the rates starting to go up because the insistence that it happens is coming from the feds, and states have to comply. The area that I think we really need to fix is the federal law that dictates that bio parents who hadn't rehabilitated within a certain period of time, state agencies, the DCFs, have to move towards terminating their parental rights. In court, that's a legal process in order for those children to get legal permanency, either adoption or guardianship. And that kind of goes counter to kinship and relative placement, because the conversation then that is required for child welfare to have with relatives, grandparents, and everyone else is that you got to agree with us that we're going to terminate your daughter's rights to the child, that parental rights to the child that she has. And no parent wants that to happen. They'll raise their children to their adults. They don't want that legal action to occur on their relative. That is the most difficult conversation and the most uncomfortable conversation to have in any community, but mostly in black and brown communities, that kind of intimate action to take against your loved one in court to terminate their rights. And that, at times, has caused a lot of friction in the kinship and relative caregiver placement process. And one of the reasons people will say, we don't want to do this because I'm not going to do this to my daughter, I'm not going to do this to my son, my brother, my sister, or my cousin.
You know, before I transfer to you, Congresswoman, I think there are a couple things that are just very clear. You know, bureaucracy cannot love a child and it cannot raise a child, right? And you need family. And at the end of the day, that's the conversation here, and that families are being separated in a couple different ways. Whether that separation comes because you literally remove that child and place them with the stranger in the foster care system, or whether you did place them in a kin home, but we didn't actually provide enough support to make sure that the tension that comes with that type of experience, that type of trauma, that type of conflict is not being mitigated. And so we have work to do to figure out what should this system look like? What should this type of support look like? And there's a role for folks with the lived experience to help shape it. There's a role for folks who provide the actual support, the services like Dr. Anita. And there are folks that need to be at the table like the folks who work in the system to be able to do that. So, Congresswoman, you have heard us now for about an hour, maybe a little more. And I'm so curious to hear your thoughts and what's going through your mind.
Wow. This has really been a rich conversation with people who've seen and experienced the system personally as well as professionally. What I heard consistently here is that these wraparound services have got to be initiated immediately. You can't do the stop and drop. And I've seen that. Social worker pulls up, drop the kids off, and off they go. And that those wraparound services are different for every single child. I mean, you got a child who's starting fires and won't unpack and killing animals. That's a different child than an infant that you're bringing to someone's home. That training, a 10-hour sort of training, is no substitute for other wrap-around services which every child and the family needs. One of the things that I wished we had talked about a little bit more, and Sixto, you brought it up a little bit, is sort of the pretext for removing kids from their home in the first place. You talked about the kids being taken away because they've been neglected. We know that parents don't have enough money. You know, there's more muff than money. And so if you're going to come in and check and see if there's food in the house today, and it's the 29th of September, you know, you likely to find a refrigerator that's empty, and not because somebody just cleaned it out. And that we need to differentiate between, we need to think twice, 2-3 times before we remove a child. Some of those wraparound services may just involve informing parents about services to which they're available. A lot of people are eligible for food stamps and don't know it, and don't realize it, and won't. The stigma means that there won't be that uptake. They might need housing assistance. You brought that up. Dr. Annette, you brought up juvenile delinquency, saying that you want to stay on the same topic. That is part of the whole story. People have often talked about the foster care system as being a pipeline to jail. And so you don't have those interventions early on. That could be a consequence. I'm concerned about, when we start talking about improvements to the system, I worry a lot about the funding streams and about, you know, the legal intent. I work a lot. I'm a member of the Ways and Means Committee, and Danny Davis is my chairman on the subcommittee on families and children. Foster care comes under that purview, as well as TANF. Now, the TANF program is how we have funded Kinship Care. Kinship Care in our state, $200 a month versus the $800, $900 a month you would get if that child were placed in foster care, including all the wraparound services. And that's done deliberately. You know, TANF deliberately is not interested in kinship care because they're assuming that that's some sort of game that the parent is playing to get around the work requirements. You know, I'm going to go and put my baby in mama's house, and then somehow I'm going to be able to access the foster care money. You know, I have a lived experience, and maybe this, I had been accepted at Marquette University, and I was pregnant and gave birth to my infant daughter, and, you know, wasn't on welfare, but I applied for Medicaid and welfare, and they said, no, we're not going to give you any welfare because you have income. They counted Marquette University's tuition and the book vouchers as income.
You're right about that.
And, you know, so the school tried to intervene and explain that to them. So therefore, here I had this brand new baby and I had no income, really. So my sister, God rest her soul, decided I'm going to go get a foster care license so I can take care of my niece and encourage my sister to stay in school. Don't you know that the social workers one day, suspicious of everything, showed up at my sister's house like on a Sunday and busted me in my pajamas at my sister's house, where I had left the dormitory to come and spend some time with my daughter, and threatened, you know, to cut her license. You know, she wasn't on kinship care. She was a foster care, which was why that really, you know, lends itself to what you were saying, Michael, that some people don't want to go through that, and through that risk. So I think that what I heard you say, Dr. Annette, is that, and I'm quoting you directly here, is that foster care doesn't work, that the system is set up where the foster care they have a preference for stranger care over kinship care. And so, you know, when we start talking about the best interest of the child, some stranger may or may not be the answer, but and I want you to repeat those data and statistics and about the outcomes for children when they're placed with the loving relative.
Yeah, so what's so exciting about right now is that there's been 20 years of research, and many people have done different studies. And one of those studies showed that when you place a child with a relative, their high school graduation rate is 67% compared to a child in foster care who had a group home experience of 35%.
Wow.
When a young person ages out of care, what we know is that by the age of 26, that about half are employed, less than 3% are getting a bachelor's degree, and there's some additional negative outcomes. And it gets even scarier when we look at things like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children just released a report talking about that 76% of the kids that they have found who and rescued from being sexually trafficked had foster care experience.
That's right.
And so what we have is when children don't have a family, when children are not loved, when there's not that committed network of people who are going to show up with you no matter what you do, right, then we see very, very bad things happen. And so I think we're living in a time where we have the opportunity to shift that, but it is clear we need a different system than the traditional child welfare system. Right. It needs to be a different process for licensing, a different process for finding family, a different process for providing supports in there. And we do need to fund it. Right now, what we know about the 28,000 young people who age out is that we literally pay $7.6 billion in negative outcomes a year. Mm-hmm. And this is not futuristic money. We're talking a year. For every 4,370 young people that are accessing homelessness services, services during that period. A night, collectively, we're talking $9.6 million. Right now, the federal government has given us $20 million for the country to test out resource navigation for kinship parents. We don't actually have a money problem here. What we have is where we're allocating that money. Because when I look at software costs, for example, and I won't bore you to death, but when I look at software costs, the state of California and the state of New York City, they both have case management systems that cost more than $400 million. The maintenance cost in California for their software system is $94 million a year, half of that being charged to the feds. And so when I think about where's the money, let's take the money away from the for-profits that are benefiting greatly, and how might we actually fund the intervention that works? Because what we do know works is when families have enough money to meet their basic needs.
And you know, we do have some more lived experiences right in my own family. My sister, that I referenced earlier, God rest her soul, rescued one of her grandchildren, and she had no daughters, so this was a son. She rescued her grandson from foster care in California, but it took her 18 months. And that was a cost to building family relationships. That child is still a part of our family. And even though my sister has passed away, I got my sister here in the audience, who really took a leave of absence from work to bond with this child. But, you know, he was like 18 months old by the time we got him. And so he finally met me and said to me, "I don't like you." And I said, "I don't care. You're going to need me more than I need you." And I love this nephew now. I love his child. And he is a part, as you say, of a family who loves him.
Excellent. Love it.
Thank you so much. This was rich. And so we're going to get some questions from the audience,
Yes.
right?
Yes. So we see some folks lining up. All righty, and if we need someone to run the mic, if you want to raise your hand, if you want to stay in your seat, we can have someone run it to you too. Okay. And we're on mic 1. Go ahead. Hello, hello? No? Here, take mine.
Hello. So, first of all, thank you guys. This has been crazy informative, and I appreciate you all taking the time. So my name is Kimberly. I just started with the Children's Defense Fund. As someone with lived experience, I can attest to the fact that my grandmother took in all 6 of my mother's children when she passed. But the adoption process took about 10 years. So my question is specifically about the vetting process for both kin care takers and outside of kin care. It doesn't appear to be okay, let me put it this way. I believe that the foster care system is perpetuating the trauma in that, Cisco, you gave I thought was a powerful point in that you had a family member who was in the business of fostering children, but the system didn't know who his family was or who their family unit was. And I think that contributes to the perpetuated trauma that these children are still experiencing. The second portion of that is that we're not listening to children. You said you had to tape a microphone or something to your chest in order to get proof. And when children are not put in a position where they are asked whether they feel that they are safe, we are calling this safety at the center, and we're not actually seeing that, if that's making sense. So it looks like, I mean, I don't want to go biblical, but even in the Bible, God delivered or killed everyone when he wanted to start again. It seems like this system needs to be thrown out or forsaken if we're going to actually make headway instead of sitting around and talking about it, which I've seen for years. These children are becoming worse off after the system than prior to. So can we just talk a little bit more about the vetting process for these foster parents? Also, last component is the mental health component. It appeared that my grandmother needed parenting classes. She was highly upset. She raised all her kids, and we're now the third set that she had to raise in her 60s. And we were all under 7. 6 of us under 7 at one time. It's a lot for anyone. And they thought it was more important to provide her with parenting classes, but no one addressed the mental health component, which literally worked against her the entire time.
So I'm going to pass it to you to give like 30 seconds on the vetting, and then if someone else wants to comment, we could do that.
Sure. Thank you for the question. You sparked a thought in my mind in regards to, similar to the defund police movement that happened. There's also the up-in foster care movement going on, where folks are calling for the end of foster care as we know it as well, and it's a valid reason for some of their concerns about it. And what you described is, like in our state, all foster parents, be they core homes or relatives, are licensed. Every state don't license relatives. And there's this phenomenon that's emerging called, shadow foster care. They treat them as if they're licensed and put all the rules and restrictions, but they don't license them. The supports, the financial supports that you're talking about that you all needed with your grandmother comes, I think, at the point of licensure, because that's where all the resources are in that system. The unregulated, unlicensed relative system, that's TANF. Yeah,
Right.
that's TANF.
That's TANF.
And they don't support that system the way a license would, because that comes from the 4E budget, which is out of the Social Security Act, which gives a lot more money to families. It's a per child amount rather than a one amount for the whole family.
And I'll say that, I truly believe we got to figure out how is it that we can, for a portion of our kin families, be able to provide the resource without the licensing and the restrictions. I don't know what that approval process should look like. I think that's what we have to figure out as a community, and figure out how do you still keep children safe. But what I do know is that the stringency of the licensing process is preventing people from being able to do this.
Yeah, but the Family First Act that you all passed in 2018 is the first start that really looks at giving states the flexibility to create different types of licensure so that they can get the resources to relatives rather than just making it a relative placement and no supports.
I'll make this short and simple.
Okay.
I actually really feel like grandmothers should not have to adopt their children, their grandchildren. I don't.
I'll share one quick innovation. There is an innovation right now that's going on where it's called Soul Family. A few of us with lived experience have designed, what if you can create legal family without actually having to terminate rights and to actually go through adoption? And so I'm excited about that project. I'm not as connected anymore with it, but it's going into testing in 3 different sites. So how do you create legal family without termination, without adoption? Soul Family. S-O-U-L. So.
Good afternoon. I'm really excited. You guys had a lot of informative information. I am a former foster youth as well. I experienced foster care, kinship care, but I'm also a licensed social worker and been in the field and PhD student. And so my question is, I've heard a lot about training and not enough 10 hours here. I think I live in the Maryland area, so it's 20 hours out here, and then you have to have 20 hours a year. But what I'm hearing as a collective, that it's not the same across each state. And that's alarming and that's a concern, because not everybody is getting the same information or lack thereof. And so I want to ask you guys on the platform is, how can we have, like, as a, U.S., like, have everyone get the same information and get the right training that's needed in the homes for the betterment of the family and the child?
Well, I think one of the things that we've mentioned here already is the Family First policy passed on the federal level, because, we have, the Commerce Clause, and you hear it often in the context of racism, states' rights, or gun conversations, but that each state puts together their own state plan for administering welfare or foster care, and you're right, the guidance has got to come from the federal government about what the floor is. Someone earlier had asked about Medicaid. Same thing. Every state had different ages at which you could continue to receive Medicaid after you turned 18. And you literally were stuck. If you got a job in Illinois and you lived in Wisconsin, if Illinois hadn't expanded, if their state plan didn't allow foster youth to get services up to 21, and certainly given the Obamacare to be able to get it up to age 26, you literally was stuck in a state if you hadn't found that job that provided health care. And who at age 18 has a job that provides private health insurance? No one. And so, again, what we need to do on the federal level, and we have put together this legislation in memory of DJ Joy, is to try to get health care across the board, no matter what state you're in, to be able to provide Medicaid for folk who have aged out of foster care beyond age 18, and as an example. We're going to continue to pursue that. I hope that's responsive to your question.
Thank you. So we have 2 questions. I'm going to have you each ask your questions because we have 4 minutes. And so I want each of you to ask your question, and then we'll answer both questions, and then we're going to wrap it up. Does that sound good? All right, let's take it away. Question 1, question 2, and then we'll talk. Question 1, go ahead. Okay. Okay.
We cannot hear, huh?
Do you want me to go?
Hello. Can you? Okay, great. Good morning, Congresswoman. Thank you for organizing this event. My name is Stephen James. I'm the Director of Constituent Services in Houston's District D, the Office of Council Lady Carolyn Evans Shabazz. My question is, we've been approached by a local nonprofit foster care program to set up a Kinship Care program in Houston's Sunnyside community. I particularly came here today to ask for leadership in setting this program up properly. I've listened to every comment you all have said and taken notes. So after this is over, I would appreciate the opportunity to work with somebody to make certain that we do this the right way.
Well, thank you for that ask.
And I want to point you over here, too. We have quite a bit of folks who are experts at KIN on the stage, and folks who have been funding this work and doing this work across the country, too, right here in the front, Casey Family Programs. So thank you for that ask, and we will be very responsive. Careful what you wish for, because now we're going to give you everything.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tasha Roberson-Wing, and I am a CBCF fellow and founder of Diaries of a Black Girl in Foster Care. And my question is surrounding, there's been conversations with those with lived experience who expressed that family members had a fear of getting involved with the court system and fear that those that are already in their homes will be removed. So I was wondering, is this something that you have seen through your experience, and what can we ask of policymakers? What can we ask that we can put in policy to ease the fear?
I'll address that one and the previous one, too, in this one response. Just going back to the Family First legislation, that is the most groundbreaking, revolutionizing legislation to pass to change child welfare that we've had in decades, and people don't know much about it. Part of that legislation now requires legal representation to be offered to families by the agencies paid for and reimbursed from the federal government. And so one way of supporting families through the court process is to have them legally represented, because, you know, without legal representation, you know, they get lost in the maze of decision making and don't really appreciate the gravity of the things they are agreeing to until it's over. And so to have an attorney at the very beginning afford it to you, to walk you through it from the beginning is important. Along with kinship navigation services, it's also a part of the Family First Act. The federal government has outlined all the elements that need to be a part of the kinship navigation programs.
All righty. Well, with that being said, we want to check out with one word, as we have less than 1 minute here. So if there's one word to describe how you're leaving the stage, what would be your word? I'll give you 3 words.
Persistent.
Yeah, act, just act.
Activities.
I say consistence also.
Consistence. I want to thank every single one of you for choosing to be here. Family matters, kinship matters. Our young people have a future because those of us who are acting and supporting and making sure that we figure out what does this new system need to look like. And so thank you to the sponsors, Casey Family Program, for the work that you are doing day in and day out to support states as they're on these hard journeys too. So thank you, everyone.